In the dusty, war-torn streets of North Africa, where the desert winds whispered tales of coming change, Sergeant Marco Bellini stood at the edge of destiny. As rumors of the mighty American forces reached his ears, a single thought haunted his every waking moment. We knew it was over when the Americans landed. This is the story of courage and collapse, of a world forever altered by the shifting sands of war. In the sun-baked streets of Tripoli, the war seemed both distant and uncomfortably close. Sergeant Marco Bellini, a young Italian soldier with eyes reflecting a too-soon aged soul, trudged along the dusty roads of the garrison town. He was far from the vineyards and olive groves of his Tuscan home, now just a fading memory against the backdrop of war's desolation. The air buzzed with the voices of soldiers and locals alike, a mix of Italian and Arabic mingling in the market's chaos. Despite the scorching North African sun, a chill of uncertainty lingered. Rumors like persistent flies buzzed relentlessly, whispers of an impending shift, a giant awakening across the Atlantic. Marco's unit, a motley crew of young men drawn from across Italy's regions, shared tales of home and fears of what was to come. They were a patchwork of the peninsula's varied heritage, from the alpine north to the sun-drenched south, bound together under the tricolor flag that now seemed to symbolize more of a question than an answer. As the days shortened and the nights grew cooler, news trickled in. The British were pushing west and the Germans were reinforcing. But it was the talk of the Americans, a force as distant as the moon, that murmured loudest in the dimly lit corners of the barracks and cafes. Some scoffed at the idea. How could these newcomers change the tide of a war that had already consumed the world? But others, like Marco, felt a tremor of something they hadn't in years: hope. Marco's duties were mundane but vital, from guarding supply routes to training fresh recruits who arrived with eyes wide and untested. He wrote letters home filled with reassurances and omitted fears, painting a picture of routine and downplaying the whispers of change. Yet, each letter grew harder to pen, the words tasting more of ash than ink. The city itself, an ancient crossroads of cultures, seemed to hold its breath. Italian and German officers paraded the streets with feigned assurance, while shopkeepers and families watched with a cautious gaze, their lives upended by the shifting sands of allegiance and conquest. In the bustling heart of Tripoli, Marco met with his closest friend, Lieutenant Alessandro Rossi. They found solace in shared memories and quiet discussions about the future. Alessandro, with his quick smile and quicker wit, often played the optimist to Marco's growing cynicism. "The Yanks won't know what hit them," Alessandro would say, clapping Marco on the back, his laughter barely concealing the undercurrent of doubt. But as November neared, the reality of the situation began to set in. Reconnaissance flights increased, the clash of distant artillery grew more frequent, and the once-dismissed rumors of an American landing turned into a tide of anxious anticipation. Then, one fateful morning, as the first light crept over the horizon, the silence was shattered. The Americans had landed. The war, with all its distant thunder, had arrived at their doorstep. Marco gathered with his unit as officers barked orders, the once routine day dissolving into chaos. There was no time for fear or hesitation, only action. As they mobilized, Marco took a moment to look towards the Mediterranean, its waters reflecting the fiery hues of dawn. In that brief, serene moment, he understood. The war was changing, and with it, their fates. The Americans were here, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the American landing were a blur of activity and anticipation. News of the invasion spread like wildfire through the ranks, each detail more harrowing than the last. The Allies had landed in Morocco and Algeria, and their intentions were clear. They were here to stay, to push, to conquer. In the barracks, the atmosphere was tense, a mixture of fear and a strange, reluctant respect for the enemy that had finally stepped into the fray. Sergeant Marco Bellini found himself caught between the roles of a leader to his men and a soldier under the ever-straining weight of command. He spent his days bolstering defenses and his nights poring over maps and intelligence, trying to anticipate the next move in this great chess game of war. The once distant conflict had suddenly become intensely personal, each decision a matter of life and death. Lieutenant Alessandro Rossi remained a beacon of morale, his unyielding optimism as sturdy as the ancient Roman ruins that dotted the landscape. "They may have the numbers, but we have the heart," he would declare, clapping soldiers on the back, his voice cutting through the murk of uncertainty. But the heart was weary. The Italian forces, stretched thin and lacking the might of their German allies, felt the immensity of what was to come. Marco noticed the changes in his men, the quiet conversations, the lingering glances toward home, the letters penned with a trembling hand. The locals, too, sensed the shifting tides. In the markets and cafes where the soldiers sought brief respite, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Whose side would prevail? What would become of their land, their families, their very way of life? One afternoon, as the sun beat down on the arid landscape, Marco and his unit were called to a meeting. Command had information, they said, about the American movements. Intelligence suggested a push eastward, towards the heart of Axis control in North Africa. The meeting was a cacophony of voices, each officer and commander vying to be heard. Plans were drawn and redrawn, strategies debated with the fervor of men who knew the gravity of their decisions. Marco listened, his mind racing as the weight of command pressed down upon him. Later, under the canvas of his tent, Marco reflected on the situation. He thought of his family, of the rolling hills of Tuscany, of a life that seemed a world away. He thought of the young men under his command, each with their own story, their own dreams suspended in the balance of war. As night fell, a sense of resolve settled over him. He would lead his men with all the courage and wisdom he could muster. They would stand against the tide, against the giants that marched upon them. But in the quiet of his own heart, a whisper of doubt lingered. The Americans, with their endless resources and unwavering determination, were unlike any enemy they had faced. They were the giants of a new world, and against them, the old world seemed fragile, ready to crumble. And so, as the stars blanketed the sky, Marco penned another letter home, each word a promise, a hope, a prayer. He sealed it with a quiet determination, knowing that tomorrow the war would demand everything of him once more. The morning of the operation was marked by a deceptive calm, the sea mirroring the clear skies, oblivious to the storms of war that churned beneath the surface. Sergeant Marco Bellini and his men stood at their posts, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the Mediterranean met the sky in a thin blue line. The air was thick with tension, every soldier acutely aware of the impending clash. The rumors had solidified into reality, their once abstract enemy materializing into a formidable force approaching their shores. As dawn broke, the first signs of the invasion became visible. Distant shapes appeared on the horizon, growing steadily larger and more distinct. Ships, an armada of them, advancing with a relentless purpose. The sun, rising behind them, cast long shadows that seemed to reach for the land itself. Marco's heart pounded in his chest, a rapid drumbeat echoing the collective anxiety of his unit. He had faced combat before, had stared down the barrel of his rifle into the face of the enemy. But this was different. The Americans brought with them a promise of change, a whisper of an end for better or worse. The first booms of naval gunfire shattered the morning stillness, a fearsome chorus that marked the beginning of the battle. Explosions bloomed on the shore, sending plumes of sand and smoke into the air. The ground shook beneath their feet, a relentless, terrifying rhythm. Marco shouted orders, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that surged through his veins. He directed his men, positioning them to return fire, to hold the line against the approaching tide. As the enemy drew closer, the sky darkened with aircraft, their engines a deafening roar overhead. Bombs fell like rain, each explosion a deadly bloom of fire and debris. The beach became a maelstrom of chaos and destruction, a no-man's land of torn earth and shattered lives. Despite the fear, despite the overwhelming odds, Marco and his men fought with a desperate tenacity. They fired at the shadows that loomed over them, at the figures that surged forward with the waves. Each shot was a defiance, a refusal to yield, to give in to the crushing weight of inevitability. The hours stretched on, every minute an eternity of conflict. The beach turned into a landscape of craters and ruin, the air filled with the cries of the wounded, the roar of guns, the relentless crash of the sea. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tide of battle shifted. The Allied forces, with their superior numbers and firepower, began to gain ground. Inch by inch, they pushed forward, overwhelming the defenders with a relentless assault. Marco found himself retreating, leading his men back through the streets of the town they had sworn to protect. Buildings that had once been familiar landmarks were now burning husks, the air thick with smoke and the smell of death. As they withdrew, Marco's mind raced with the implications of their retreat. What did it mean for the war, for his country, for himself? The world he knew was crumbling around him, and in its place, a new, uncertain future was taking shape. The day ended with the setting sun, a fiery orb sinking into the sea, indifferent to the suffering it left in its wake. The Americans had landed, had established their foothold, and with it, the first chapter of the end had been written. Marco and his men regrouped, counting their losses, tending to their wounds. They were beaten, but not broken. The war was far from over, and they would fight on, for as long as they drew breath. But as Marco looked out over the devastated landscape, the burning town, the ravaged beach, he knew in his heart that something fundamental had changed. The Americans had landed, and with them, they brought the beginning of the end. The days following the American landing were a relentless march of uncertainty and hardship. Marco Bellini and his unit, now a shadow of their former selves, were pushed back, retreating through the unforgiving desert that stretched out like an endless sea of sand and sorrow. The retreat was grueling. Marco led his men across arid landscapes under a sun that showed no mercy. They moved mostly at night, seeking respite from the scorching heat, their path illuminated by the stars that watched over them, silent witnesses to their plight. Each day brought news of further advancements by the Allied forces. Town by town, stronghold by stronghold, the Axis powers were being eroded, their grand ambitions crumbling like the ancient ruins that dotted the landscape. The might of the American military, combined with the British and other Allied forces, was a tide no one could stem. In the moments of respite, Marco found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The memories of home seemed like a distant dream, the laughter and warmth a stark contrast to the harsh reality of his current existence. He thought of his family, of the letters filled with hope and reassurance he had penned, each word a heavier burden on his conscience. Alessandro, ever the source of strength and camaraderie, seemed to sense Marco's growing despondency. "We fight on, Marco," he would say, "for our brothers, for our homes, until the very end." His words, though meant to inspire, often fell on the hardened ground of Marco's resolve. But it wasn't just the Allied forces that they battled. The desert itself was an unforgiving enemy, its sands shifting underfoot, its winds a howling reminder of their isolation. Water was scarce, and the rations dwindled with each passing day. The men's faces, once filled with youthful determination, now bore the scars of war, eyes hollowed by what they had seen, what they had lost. The battles were numerous, each a desperate struggle to hold back the inevitable. They fought against tanks that seemed like monsters of steel, against men who were as determined and as fearful as they were. The ground was littered with the detritus of war, the abandoned tanks, the fallen soldiers, a testament to the devastation that had passed. One fateful day, as they prepared to defend a strategic point, Marco received word of a massive offensive. The Allies were planning a decisive strike, one that would likely cut through the Axis defenses and open a path straight to the heart of their territory. The order was to hold the line, to fight with everything they had. Marco relayed the command to his men, his voice steady, his resolve firm. They prepared their defenses, set their sights on the horizon, and waited for the storm to arrive. And arrive it did. The horizon erupted in a fury of gunfire and explosions, the earth shaking beneath their feet. Marco led his men into the fray, each step a defiance of the death that rained down around them. The battle raged for hours, a blur of noise and violence that consumed everything. Marco fought with a fierce determination, his every move a fight for survival, for the chance to see another day. When the dust settled, the landscape was transformed. The once defiant line of defense was now a scarred field of wreckage and despair. Marco's unit, decimated by the assault, was a fraction of what it had been. As they regrouped, Marco looked at the faces of his surviving men. Each one carried the weight of the fallen, the burden of the continued fight. But there was also a resolve, a silent agreement that they would continue, that they would carry the memories of their brothers with them. The retreat continued, a slow, painful march through a land that offered no quarter. But with each step, with each battle, the end seemed to draw closer. The Allied forces were pushing them back, closing in with a relentless determination. Marco knew the war was changing, that the sands of time and fate were shifting beneath their feet. The Americans had landed, had changed the course of the conflict. And as he led his men through the desert, he understood that they were not just retreating from the enemy, but from an old world that was fading into the annals of history. The relentless push of the Allied forces continued unabated, a wave of determination that swept across North Africa. For Marco Bellini and the remnants of his unit, each day was a grueling testament to their diminishing resolve. The once proud Axis defense was now a ragged shadow, retreating through a land scarred by the very war they had helped to unleash. The desert, once a vast expanse of open possibilities, had become a suffocating cage. The heat was relentless, the sun a merciless observer of their plight. The nights offered little respite, filled with the haunting memories of fallen comrades and the unending dread of what the next day would bring. Marco's leadership was tested, like never before. He found himself making decisions that carried the weight of lives, knowing that each order might lead to more loss, more sacrifice. The faces of his men, gaunt and shadowed with fatigue, were a constant reminder of the heavy burden he bore. Alessandro, his stalwart friend, had grown quiet over the days. The light of defiance that once shone in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a resigned acceptance of their fate. Yet he fought on, his loyalty to Marco and the men unwavering amidst the chaos. The news from the front was always grim. The Allies had taken key cities, their forces moving with a coordinated precision that left little room for resistance. The German troops, once the backbone of the Axis campaign in Africa, were withdrawing, their might stretched thin across the vast fronts of a global war. Then came the order that they had all dreaded yet expected. They were to retreat, to abandon their positions and fall back to a more defensible line. It was a tacit admission of defeat, a signal that the end was near. The retreat was chaotic, a desperate attempt to salvage what little they could. Equipment was abandoned, vehicles burnt, anything to slow the advancing enemy. The men moved with a silent urgency, their every action tinged with the bitter taste of retreat. As they moved, the landscape around them bore the scars of their journey. Burnt-out tanks and vehicles littered the roadside, each a grave marker for the anonymous dead. The towns they passed were hollow shells, their inhabitants long fled or lost to the ravages of war. But it was not just the physical landscape that had changed. The men themselves were different, hardened by the horrors they had witnessed, by the losses they had endured. They spoke less, their conversations a mix of necessary orders and quiet reflection. Marco felt the change within himself. The war had taken its toll, carving deep lines of worry and regret across his once youthful face. He wondered about the future, about what would become of them all in a world that had been forever altered by the conflict. The final stand, when it came, was a somber affair. They had been pushed to a small coastal town, the sea at their backs, the enemy before them. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. They fought with a grim determination, each man aware that this might be their last battle. The Allied forces, sensing victory, pressed forward with a relentless drive. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and explosions, a cacophony of destruction that seemed to shake the very earth. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it was over. The white flags were raised, the guns fell silent. Marco and his men were prisoners of war, their fate now in the hands of the enemy. As they were led away, Marco looked back at the town, at the land that had been their final battleground. It was over. The war, their war, had ended not with a triumphant roar, but with a weary, defeated sigh. The Americans had landed, had changed the course of the conflict, of history. And as Marco walked into captivity, he knew that the world they were leaving behind would never be the same again. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over for Marco Bellini and his men. They were prisoners now, confined within a camp that was stark and efficient, a reflection of the very forces that had defeated them. The days blended into each other, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the occasional letters from home, filled with words that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Marco's world had shrunk to the confines of the barbed wire, the barracks, and the faces of his fellow prisoners. They were a community of the defeated, each man grappling with his own regrets and memories. Yet, in their shared defeat, there was a strange camaraderie, a mutual understanding born from loss. Alessandro was still by his side, a constant presence amidst the uncertainty. They spoke often, reminiscing about the past, pondering the future. The dreams they had once shared seemed naive now, foolish even. Yet, they clung to them, a lifeline in a sea of despair. As the months passed, news of the wider war trickled in. The Allies were pushing forward, liberating countries, toppling regimes. The world was changing, reshaping itself after years of conflict, and they were mere spectators, watching from the sidelines, their roles reduced to footnotes in the annals of history. Eventually, the war ended. The news arrived in a flurry of excitement and relief, a distant celebration that they could only imagine. The camp was abuzz with speculation, with hope. What would happen to them? Would they be freed, allowed to return home? Or would they remain forgotten relics of a defeated army? For Marco, the end of the war brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, for the conflict's conclusion, but also apprehension about the future, about returning to a world that had moved on without him. He wondered about his family, about the small town that he had left behind. What would he find when he returned? Could he even return to the life he once knew? When the day of release finally came, it was an anticlimactic affair. There were no triumphant marches, no tearful reunions, just a long journey back to an Italy that was vastly different from the one he had left. The country was in ruins, its cities devastated, its people scarred by years of conflict. The grandeur that had once defined the nation was now a faded memory, its legacy buried beneath the rubble of war. Marco returned to his hometown, a place that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. The streets were the same, but the faces were different, older, wearied by the years of hardship. His family welcomed him with open arms, their joy a bittersweet reminder of all that had been lost. In the months that followed, Marco tried to rebuild his life. He found work, reconnected with old friends, tried to find a semblance of normalcy. But the war lingered, a shadow that followed him, a whisper that echoed in his every step. He saw it in the eyes of the veterans, in the war memorials that dotted the town, in the stories that were passed down, a legacy of bravery and sacrifice, of loss and despair. The war had ended, but its echoes remained, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid. And as Marco looked towards the future, he knew that he would carry those echoes with him, a part of his story, a part of the world's history. The Americans had landed, had changed the course of the war, of his life, and nothing would ever be the same again.